politics.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics, and we do begin this morning with Salt Lake Tribune political columnist Robert Gehrke. He's here to look back at the legislative session. Robert, always glad to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Good to be here, Glenn.
Let's start with the bombshell that was released the final hours on Friday night of the final day of the session. Transgender athletes banned from sports in the state of Utah. Set the stage for us.
Well, this has been an issue that's been debated in nation's capitals around the country, or state capitals around the country. And last year there was a bill that would have imposed a blanket ban on athletes who were born male competing with girls. And the governor said he would veto that bill if it got to his desk, and it didn't. So Representative Kara Birkeland spent the last year trying to, work with both sides of this issue to come to some agreement. It looked like they were headed in that direction. There was a commission that initially would have measured wingspan and thigh to hip ratio and muscle mass and things like that. The LGBTQ groups were not comfortable with that, so there was an agreement to take that out, and it looked like it was going to, go ahead and pass smoothly. But in the last days, as I learned from speaking to a number of lawmakers and lobbyists on this issue, those votes, the support for that kind of eroded. There was a hard push by the Eagle Forum to try to get a full ban. And so they ended up in this position where there was some support for a full ban, some support for a commission, and some support for doing nothing. And then at the end of the session, Senator Dan McKay came up with this idea of how about if we do a full ban, which will, he conceded, get struck down or enjoined by the courts most likely. And then the fallback would be a commission, and that was enough. That hybrid was enough to bring together enough votes to pass this. They waited, however, until the very end of the last night. They didn't want this coming out before the filing deadline, before they might get an opponent in their upcoming election. So they waited until after the 5 p.m. Friday filing deadline to release this. It hit the floor at about 8:30. And, we saw what happened after that.
Yeah, so much to dig into here. One thing I want to mention, even before this substitute came out, this was one of the more fascinating processes I've seen play out, where you saw the two sides working together for so long. Yeah. And when they came to this commission idea, it was like neither side was really happy about it.
Right, and the proponents of the commission would say that probably means they got it right. There was objections when there were these defined measurements that would the LGBTQ communities thought it would be embarrassing, humiliating to have these kids already dealing with issues kind of poked and prodded and measured in that sort of way. So when they took that out, there was still some concern, some heartburn, but it seemed like it was headed for passage at that point.
Yeah, another important point, Senator Fillmore, his words on the Senate floor that night I thought were very important to this conversation. I'm paraphrasing here to get to the point quickly, but he laid out that he could kind of be swayed either way as far as the issue goes, but he was not happy with the process or the procedure that was playing out that night. And I think that's probably what we saw with a lot of the Republicans who joined him in voting against this bill. Your thoughts?
Yeah, and that's really what didn't sit well with me on this too, or one of the things that didn't sit well with me on this issue, is that this wasn't made public. This was slipped in at the last minute. It was debated in closed-door Senate caucus meetings that the public never got to see or understand or provide input on. It was done without the knowledge of the governor even. Governor Cox said after it passed that he was caught by surprise and that he would veto the bill when it got there. It was just, and I think a lot of lawmakers recognize, looking back on it, that it was a terrible process. And where we are, assuming the governor follows through on his veto, which I think he will, is that we still don't have a resolution to this, and now we're going to have to go back to the drawing board, and probably with some, mistrust, some understandable mistrust, because of the bad faith of Utah lawmakers on this one.
Right, a lot of people disappointed in the process and the procedure of how this played out. Okay, as of recording, the governor had not vetoed this. It's possible he does by the time it airs. Important to point out, the vote is not enough to override the veto. So we would assume that it will stand.
Yeah, assuming the votes stay where they are, and I think it's likely that there would be fewer votes for an override than there were to pass the bill. So I think the veto would hold up if the governor does follow through on that, and like I said, I think he will.
Yeah, one last point I want to bring up that you bring up in your article and what you said here today. You brought up the timing and how it was past the filing deadline. You take a look at most of the yes votes, though, and they're in pretty safe districts. Yeah. There were a couple that surprised me that are in for fights every year and in swing districts. But do you really think that that's what played into this as far as bringing it in the last minute for the majority of those that voted yes?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an element that these legislators in these districts where this is a ban is popular now get to go back to their constituents and say, hey, I tried to ban it, you know, the governor wouldn't let us. And so I think they did score some political points at the expense, unfortunately, of you know, causing some real heartache, I think, among the transgender community. I think it's important to note that there are only 4 athletes in the state competing who, you know, as transgender athletes, according to the Utah High School Athletics Association, which has had a policy in place that seems to have worked, that requires them to go through a year of hormone therapy before they can compete with the opposite gender. So I think it's, you know, I think the policy has worked, and so there's been a lot of heartache over this that probably was unnecessary from the get-go.
Yeah, and that's one thing that Dave Spaniford with the High School Association brought up during this debate all along. Let's move to one other topic real quick. It's something you wrote about last week, and that's this power shift that we're seeing play out in the state legislature. Talk about that. Yeah,
I mean, coming into the session, it was noteworthy that over the past several decades, there's been this constant erosion of local power, power from the governor, power from school districts, by the legislature. They're just kind of sucking it up into this big vortex. And I think that continued this session in a few pretty distinctive ways. We saw, one of the things that we're seeing a lot of are these authorities, the creation of these authorities. You know, we saw the Inland Port Authority created a few years ago. They rewrote that bill to, so Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County, West Valley, Magna all lost seats on that votes on that board. We saw the creation of the Utah Lake Authority this time, which gives this appointed authority, non-elected board, the authority to collect taxes and collect revenue and contract for these projects to clean up the lake. We've seen the Point of the Mountain Authority, which had initially been planning the redevelopment of the Draper prison site. Now they're going to go ahead and start collecting revenue and redeveloping that site. And so all of these kind of come at the expense of the local governments that traditionally exercise these powers. And there were a few others. I mean, we saw efforts to try to tell school districts what they have to do in terms of curriculum and so forth. These are things school districts normally have done about including parents and so forth. So I think it's just a continuing trend, and it's a trend that really we don't see changing anytime soon, because there's just not a counterbalance to the legislature's kind of constant accrual of this power.
And they came out swinging this year right away with overturning mask mandates. Were you surprised at all as to how they went about doing that with the resolution?
Yeah,
and I mean, it didn't require the governor's signature, and it went into effect immediately.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That was one I overlooked. It was the first thing they did this session. I mean, notably, literally the first thing out of the gate was to get rid of these mask requirements in Salt Lake County, Summit County, and really anywhere else where they might have existed. They had set up this process to give counties some input on this. If a county health department wanted to put one of these mask requirements in place, they could, provided it was approved by the county council or county commission. And we saw that play out in Salt Lake County, and they didn't like it. And so at the end of the day, part of the process that they put in place was that they could rescind it. But I mean, the whole notion of setting up this process that says, well, the local governments should have input on this, the local elected officials should have input on this, and then once the local input is given, they just sort of ignore that and say, no, we're going to do what we want anyway. It kind of shows how it's sort of a sham process from the get-go. Senate President Stuart Adams said that this is an ongoing tension, an ongoing push and pull between the state government and these local governments that he says get their authority from the state. And so there's going to be a continual swinging of the pendulum, but it seems like for the last several years, the pendulum has only gone one way.
All right. Robert, where can our viewers follow you and see more of your writing?
Sure, you can read my work at sltrib.com or follow me on Twitter at Robert Gehrke.
I should have reserved the whole 30 minutes of this show for you. It goes by so fast.
I'm happy to come back anytime.
Thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Glenn.
Still to come, more on the legislative